Tonight we have an interesting opportunity to hear from an MD who is now working full-time to promote health through nutrition. Food can be a powerful medicine. Study after study has demonstrated that a healthy diet is a key to avoiding chronic illnesses of many types. And what I've seen from personal experience is that when you make the decision to do everything you can to improve your health, you open your eyes and you open your ears to the knowledge that is out there and available. And with that, you can change your health outcomes. When it comes to nutrition and health, there are many people with things to say. Some sources are better than others. The best names that I've found over the course of researching this topic for more than 5 years include Michael Greger, David Katz, Neil Barnard, Dean Ornish, John McDougall, and Joel Furman, just to name a few. And our speaker tonight, Allan Kornberg, is connected to this network, which is why I was so delighted when he accepted our invitation to make tonight's presentation. Allan is an MIT grad, course 7, biology, and an MD with years of experience practicing pediatrics and emergency medicine. And he has recently taken on the responsibility as the US Executive Director of a global NGO, the Physicians Association for Nutrition, or PAN for short. PAN is committed to educating professionals and students, the general public, and policymakers about the value of whole food, plant-based nutrition in promoting good health and in preventing and treating disease. So please join me in welcoming Allan Kornberg.
Well, Dave, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate it. And I'll get into the talk now. I never ever think of, as a very nice introduction, I never think of my talks as being the high point of anyone's day. But since I'm really what stands between some of us and Joe Biden and Donald Trump tonight, that may very well be. So that depends on your pleasure. So that's me and in my organization. Just so you have, and I'll show it at the end as well. But just so you have my contact info, if anyone wants to drop me an email, it's just a.kornberg@pan-usa.org, and my landline and mobile numbers there as well. If anybody ever wants to reach out, go for it. So what I'll just briefly outline the topics or subtopics for today. We'll start with lifestyle medicine in general, which includes nutrition. It isn't only about nutrition. And blue zones. Those are parts of the world where people are particularly healthy. I'll say a few words about, or a few slides about climate and diet. Power of nutrition is the core, the guts, if you'll pardon the expression, the guts of the talk. And then some description about clinical practice, doctors, nurse practitioners, PAs, other clinicians, and nutrition, behavior change, how physicians and others see nutrition. And then I'll end with a few words, a plug or a PSA or what have you about my charity, Physicians Association for Nutrition, at the end. So first, lifestyle medicine, the key attributes. So there's a number of us in medicine now that recognize that it's not all about surgery and medicines, not that those don't matter. And I practiced for many years and practiced pediatrics and practiced peds emergency medicine, and did prescribed lots of pills and did lots of things with my hands. Not a surgeon, but certainly lots of ER procedures. So plenty of place for that, of course. In terms of attributes that lead into or support health and wellness, and then can prevent disease and mitigate the disease severity. Lifestyle medicine is the umbrella for all of those. So life purpose, having a purpose or meaning in life, that can be family, it can be work, it could be other activities, but having a purpose, sense of community, whatever that is. For many of us now, it's connecting with folks by Zoom, but there you have it. Stress management and good sleep are truly, genuinely important to health. And when I give this talk to, or talk like this to physicians, and especially to medical students and residents, I usually put a emoji smiley face next to stress management and good sleep, but it's true. And physicians don't always practice what we preach. Low alcohol, alcohol is, there's a number of studies alcohol in large amounts is definitely bad for us. And the current recommendations for men as well as women now are no more than 1 drink a day. Used to be up to 2 drinks a day for men. Alcohol is carcinogenic as well as the other attributes that we know as a negative towards. On the other hand, one glass of wine, a day, and red wine is probably a little better. Or any other 1 drink is probably not. It's probably on balance not a bad thing. Exercise is of course important. You don't need me to tell you that. And then the primary focus of this evening's talk is a healthy diet, predominantly whole food, plant-based. And I noted the website for ACLM, which is actually doing their annual conference starting tomorrow, and that's virtual, of course, as well as all conferences are, or almost all this year, for better or worse. So blue zones, these are areas in the world that are where people live a very long time and live healthier lives. And so, I've identified, so they are circumscribed geography within a larger region, within a country or region. So you'll see them in Italy, Japan, Okinawa. There's more words about that, Karia in Greece, Costa Rica, and then Loma Linda in the States, which I'll talk some more about in a bit. So these are places where people, as we say in New England, are wicked healthy. So they are defined as this high longevity, so that the average lifespan, and not compared to the world, but compared to that region. So say for the region in Japan I just identified, be compared to the rest of Japan, not to the world. Longevity is at least 10 years greater than expected, has a high prevalence of centenarians. People live obviously past 100 years of age. Low mortality for middle-aged people, and also low rates on an age-adjusted basis of dementia. And so then what about blue zones? Why do they exist? What's the data that supports them? And as noted, geographically separated, but striking similarity of different lifestyle behaviors, particularly diet. And so here's an example, Okinawa, which is the well-known Japanese blue zone. This is the traditional Okinawan diet, and this goes back to the 50s and 60s, and probably goes back hundreds of years before that, but was first studied by, at least by Western or outside of Japan physicians after the war. The typical pyramid, the main foods are fruits and vegetables, legumes, peas, beans, lentils. Even a little bigger bar of legumes would be good for any of us. Low glycemic grains, a little bit of fish and lean meats, and there it's mostly fish. And then small amounts of oils, sweets, and so on. The diet actually in Okinawa has deteriorated in the last generation or so. The influence, in this case, not for better, but for worse, of other parts of the developed world. But that's the typical blue zone kind of diet, which will have geographic or regional differences. There'll be a Mediterranean-ish feel to that, say in Greece, and so on. So Loma Linda. Loma Linda is center of the Seventh-day Adventist population. It's a faith-based group that has a much higher percentage of vegetarians and vegans, whole food, plant-based people than the general U.S. population. And there's a large medical center there. The Adventist Health Study was done earlier in this century, 2004, I think, for 5 or 10 years. Really big population study. It's almost impossible. In medicine, the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial, so that you're doing drug A versus drug B. Most people know this, so drug A versus placebo. You randomize the population, half get drug A, half get placebo. Neither the patients nor the doctors know who's getting which, and then you look for differences. It's almost impossible to do that sort of study long-term over population health and diet, and that wasn't done here. So people were followed, case control, followed in different segments, population segments, and but 97,000 people in the study. So that's huge, big study. No matter baseline cholesterol levels, diabetes status, blood pressure, or other metabolic findings. It's interesting, when one controlled for the sorts of things that usually you see better numbers with vegetarians and vegans, when you control for that, you still found better health. amongst vegetarians and vegans. It's interesting. And that was almost a little bit surprising and a good thing. Data shows a progressive weight increase from a total vegetarian diet means no animal products at all, so no eggs or dairy products as well as meat, towards a non-vegetarian diet. So if you look at middle-aged people, 55-year-old women and men, the folks that ate a vegan diet had on average about a 30 pounds less on a height adjusted basis than non-vegetarians, which is really a striking big difference and has major health outcomes. Levels of cholesterol, prevalence of diabetes, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome. Right, metabolic syndrome is some combination of high sugar, high blood pressure, abdominal obesity, and abdominal girth, and so on. So sort of pre-diabetes in many ways, and high risk factors for cardiovascular disease. That the closer you are to being veg, the lower the health risks in these areas. In the case of type 2 diabetes, and then as a sidebar comment, having practiced in pediatrics, and I was in med school in the late 70s, so we used to talk about, this is a segue briefly, I'll get back to subject. We used to talk about adult and pediatric onset diabetes because you didn't see type 2, which is a different disease. It's the disease of poor diet and obesity, whereas type 1 is an autoimmune disease. You didn't see type 2 in children and teenagers because there just wasn't that much obesity in teens when I started in medical school. And so now we don't call it adult and PD onset diabetes. We call it type 1 and type 2 because sadly there's a fair amount of type 2 in teens. So in any event, in the case of type 2 diabetes, prevalence in vegans and vegetarians, lacto-ovo, so have dairy and egg but not meat, was half that of non-vegetarians. That's a huge, and for those of us that know medical population studies, when you see a 10 or 15% difference in a big population, it's huge. So 50% difference is really huge. And this is after controlling for socioeconomic and lifestyle factors. That's all about diet. Striking difference. Because none of this was a double-blinded randomized controlled trial, the gold standard in my profession. None of it is beyond any doubt, but this data for a population that size is highly, highly suggestive. So climate and diet, just a few words here, since most of us, regardless of our political perspective, have interest in climate change and recognize that there's an anthropomorphic impact on climate, and diet and animal agriculture plays a role. So first, if you look at, so this is from the Center for Sustainable Systems, Michigan. Sorry, not MIT, but at Michigan. And I, in general, when I picked up either academic or NGO data for this talk, I made a point of not taking sort of hard-nosed activist kinds of NGOs, but folks that really are pretty much straight and narrow, center of the bell-shaped curve, and weren't carrying a lot of political baggage to their conclusions. So it's a basic bar graph, and so it's pounds of CO2 per serving of various foods. You can see beef is the highest, 6.61 pounds of CO2 per serving, average serving. Sheep is not shown here, but sheep would be next. Then cheese, then pork, then poultry, then eggs, then milk. And then it gets asymptotic when you get to rice, legumes, carrots, and potatoes. It's huge, 2 order of magnitude differences here in CO2 impact in what we eat, and many folks that are otherwise attentive. I'll sound preachy, so let me try and behave. But many folks that are otherwise attentive to some extent to their environmental impact, tend to think less about that around what we put in our mouths 3 or 6 or 8 times a day. So why is that? There's a whole bunch of studies published on the percent of CO2 exuded in the atmosphere based on diet, and I've seen studies from anywhere between 18% to 51%. WHO had published a study saying 51% of all CO2 is based directly or indirectly on animal agriculture, and maybe that's a little high, but it's at least 15-20% and probably higher. So if you look on the right side of this this pie chart, actual agricultural production, so that's the animals themselves, like cows farting and so on, is 11 to 15%. Deforestation is huge, huge, huge. There's, you know, in America and the rest of the world, and most people know about how huge chunks of the Amazon rainforest are chopped down for cattle grazing and for, you know, monoculture agriculture, soybeans and corn and so on, to feed cattle and other livestock. The processing, the plants, transport, packing, retail, all of that, and animal waste, the huge latrines of animal waste in places like Iowa, North Carolina, especially pigs, but other farmed animals. So this pie graph makes the case that nearly 50% of all climate, all CO2 comes from animal ag, and it may be less than that, but it's at least 18, 20% and probably higher. So before we get to our own individual health, just wanted to make a few comments about other public health-ish kinds of thoughts. So first, most people don't know this, but over 70% of all antibiotics used in the United States are on factory farms, where cows and chickens and pigs and other animals are raised in terrible conditions, terrible for our health and terrible, you know, for them as well before slaughter. So factory farms are and the reason why, so it's not as if and the animals in factory farms aren't treated individually, they're treated as cogs in the wheel, and so it's not as if there's a veterinarian who's prescribing for a sick animal. There's none of that. It's that large amounts of antibiotic are thrown out or put in feed because the conditions are so cramped and so bad that the antibiotics allow the animals to get sick from infectious disease less often and grow more quickly. And so, but of course, that creates resistant bacteria, and which is, I think most people know, resistant bacteria is a huge public health problem. You know, all the many generations of staph that, you know, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, you could treat Staph aureus, Staphylococcus with penicillin, and now it requires third and fourth order bacteria and antibiotics. And while the scientists try and stay ahead, you know, we're probably running out of our luck in terms of antibiotic resistance. And then, oh, by the way, pandemics. So it'd be speaker malpractice not to speak about zoonotic disease and about pandemics during this year. And so the great majority of pandemics currently and over history come from human interaction with animals. So it's eating animals and it's deforestation. So factory farming, wet markets, it's how bacteria and virus cross over from animals to humans. There's theories about that in AIDS as well, and many of the more typical infectious, highly infectious pandemics. And deforestation, as we push animals out of their natural habitat, they're also more likely to come into contact with us and more likely to have crossover of animal microbes to humans. Michael Greger, who Dave mentioned earlier, is one of my heroes, his colleague, and would be one of the iconic figures in the field of whole food plant-based nutrition and lifestyle medicine in general. He's also a board member of my organization, of Physician Association for Nutrition. And so I've got a couple of his quotes tonight, but one of his quotes, if you actually want to create global pandemics, then build factory farms. And so we have done that. All right, so now to the guts of the talk. Sorry, power of nutrition. So first, some information from WHO. If the major risk factors for NCDs, non-communicable diseases, were eliminated, and this is a little bit aspirational, but there's great truth in this, at around three quarters of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 would be prevented, and around 40% of cancers would be prevented as well. So it's huge, huge, huge. NCDs, non-communicable diseases, are preventable through interventions that tackle shared, public health risk factors. Obviously, tobacco, diet, what we're talking about, physical inactivity, and over utilization of alcohol. The slide's a little busy, not horrible. It's a recent study in Lancet, which is one of the AAA tier medical journals, a British journal, high quality journal. It just published last year. And so it shows, it's really striking in that it looks at 195 countries, just about everybody who's not in the UN is not an island of 30,000 people or something. So it's pretty much the whole world, and looks at the global burden of disease, published in 2019, studied in 2017. And so you would expect that as we look at the horizontal bar graph in a minute, you would expect that you'd see greater variety of dietary risks around disease, especially malnutrition and protein calorie, malnutrition, not enough, food insecurity, not enough food. But what's happened over the last generation or so, as well, there's still plenty of global intense poverty, and many people suffer from not getting enough calories. The quote unquote Western diet has become pervasive. And so if you look at so this is for the whole world. It's poor countries, middle income countries, and rich countries. I guess you call it the x-axis is deaths per million per year, or excess deaths. Dietary risks, the first bar, high blood pressure, the second most common cause. And that's, while there is a bunch of diseases, that's mostly salt and obesity. And so that's diet related as well. Tobacco's third, not first. There's been some relative improvement there. High blood sugar is also not entirely, but primarily diet, then air pollution. High BMI, high body mass index, obesity, that's also mostly diet. High LDL, cholesterol, that's diet. Malnutrition, which is interesting, that it's so, it's a horrible disease. People that suffer from not enough food. It's on a global public health basis, it's striking how low it is on this bar graph. And then alcohol, and then last on the top 10 is impaired kidney function, which is not mostly diet, and really the only the only major cause on this bar graph that's not primarily behavior based, although malnutrition is obviously a different and complicated subject. So what about eating healthy? Here you go. This somewhat, again, busy slide, but I'll talk us through it. Shows fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. I don't have a piece here for legumes, peas, beans, and lentils, which are the other that's in the top 5 good foods to eat, and important as well. And just look by example. Let's look at fruits, top left. The average, and this is I'm sorry, this is the Institute for let me move my Zoom thing around. This is the American Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation put this out. So again, another non-advocacy kind of NGO, just pretty basic. I'm just sorry, everybody. I'm just messing around with my Zoom here for a minute. Okay, now. So the average intake in America of fruits is 94 grams per day, which is the equivalent of 1 small apple. And the recommended intake is 200 to 300 grams per day, which would be the equivalent of 2 to 3 small apples. It doesn't have to be apples, but just by example. So it's not. This is not like you have to eat 18, fruits a day. For nuts and seeds, bottom left, the actual average intake for adults in America, 3 grams per day. It's equivalent to 1.5 walnut halves. It's next to nothing. So recommended 16 to 25 grams per day, which is 8 to 13 walnut halves or other nuts. Nuts are good to eat. Of course, they're high. They're high in fat, good fat. And so if you're just sitting there with a jar that big and you're just doing that, watching the game, that's not good. But a handful a day of nuts is good for us. Whole grains, actual intake 29 grams per day. That's less than 1 slice of whole grain bread, good bread, not Wonder Bread. And recommended is 100 to 150 grams per day, which would be like 3 to 5 slices. And of course, there are many other sources of whole grains. And for vegetables, we're the closest to good behavior. The average intake is 190 grams per day. That's like 3 medium-sized carrots. And the recommended intake is 300 to 430, which would be like 5 to 7 medium-sized carrots. So that's less stretchy. So you can see there's a gap between what we should be eating and what we are eating. You also can see that the gap is not astronomical. It's doable. So inflammation. So the bad foods. Let me just sorry. So the bad foods, quote unquote, are animal products, and whole food plant-based foods are healthy for us and anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. And of course, that there also are some non-animal product foods that are that can be bad, and eating sugared soda and so on, or drinking that is not a good thing, and so on. But in general, whole food plant-based nutrition is anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and especially red meat, but some other sources of animal products are inflammatory. So just taking it from 12 o'clock here, these are all based on peer review studies. There's a correlation between poor diet and Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, obviously heart disease in general, including arteriosclerosis, hardening the arteries, but heart attacks, stroke, age-related macular degeneration, which is far and away the most common cause of macular degeneration and the biggest cause of blindness in the developed world. MS, in general, increased morbidity and mortality. ALS, another horrible disease. Type 2 and insulin resistance in general, osteoporosis, a number of cancers. So, big hit list of bad diseases here, many of which are very common. So sorry to show a slide from Harvard, especially to MIT brethren, but they do some good work in public health. Just some examples, and we use this slide when we do these talks overseas, especially. Well, MIT has a good rep overseas. Harvard's brand in the health space can sometimes help when doing these talks in Europe and Asia and so on. That's why the slide is here. Foods that cause inflammation, just some examples. Refined carbs, white bread, pastry, sugar, French fries, soda. Red meats are bad for us, no doubt about that, especially processed red meat. But red meats are bad. Margarine and butter are bad for us. And so some examples of anti-inflammatory foods, everybody knows this. Tomatoes, olive oil, canola oil too. Olive oil is probably especially good. Green leafy vegetables, the darker greens are better. Any greens are good, darker greens are better. Spinach, kale, collards, broccoli is really, really good. Some nuts, fatty fish, and then almost any fruit. The berries are particularly good. Blueberries are probably especially good in the antioxidant space. But just some examples. It's I've personally been vegetarian for 30 years and totally plant-based for 18, 19 years, and have been eating an especially healthy whole food plant-based diet for the last 4 or 5 years as I pay more attention as I get older and do this work. Of course, as well, there's plenty of evidence that eating a primarily whole food plant-based diet is good for our health. The focus of this talk. There's not evidence that going from 90 and 95% to 100% vegan is any better for our health. So this is mostly about, or entirely about, making incremental change and eating a generally whole food plant-based diet. It doesn't have to be absolutist. So whole food plant-based diets versus animal products, animal product heavy diet. So everybody knows cholesterol, lipids, cardiovascular events. TMAO is a metabolic or catabolic product in our bodies of eating especially red meats. So eat red meat, and the gut biome and microbiome converts that to trimethylamine oxidase. I'm looking at that well. I think I said that right. My bad. And so that has a high correlation and probably causative with inflammation and all the diseases we've talked about, cardiovascular disease and cancer. To be a little sciencey here with MIT brethren. So telomeres are and some people, some of you know this way better than I do, and some probably haven't thought about this since taking 701, 10 or 50 years ago. I remember taking that in 1975 in 10250. Salvador Luria was the professor teaching that when I was sitting in that big lecture. Well, I doubt they do lectures there this year, given the pandemic. The lecture hall was still there. Anyhow, telomeres. And back when I did biology and genetics, it was all about base pairs, and we've learned a lot since. Telomeres are the end of chromosomes. The chromosomes get narrower, get shorter as we age, and as our DNA replicates as for each cell and for us as organisms, each replication, the DNA gets a little bit shorter, and as it gets shorter, that's a sign of aging, and runs risks around cardiovascular disease, especially cancers, and just general aging. It's how cells age. There's plenty of evidence that whole food plant-based diets high in antioxidants mitigate that, reduce the speed at which our DNA shortens in length, and that animal products, especially red meats, but animal products in general, expedite that process. Epigenetics is the expression beyond the base pairs of our genes, which is not what I was taught a million years ago, but there's plenty of evidence now that there's gene expression beyond the actual base pairs. And here too, there's plenty of scientific peer review evidence about whole food plant-based diets having a positive effect on gene expression. So it's not only choosing one's parents well, if you will, about genetics and about wealth too, I suppose. It's how we behave in life. You have real influence over gene expression. Microbiomes are the bacteria. I mean, microbiome is just any population of microorganisms, generally speaking. But for us in this talk, it's gut bacteria, and eating a whole food plant-based diet. I sound like I'm being very, very preachy here, and I'm sorry for that, but it's true that our microbiome, which has major impact on our health, we have a healthier microbiome by eating a whole food plant-based diet. And I'll show you a study about that in a minute. Sorry. So it's not only so whole food plant-based heavy or centric diets clearly correlate with health and wellness and the prevention of disease. Also have been shown to reverse some diseases in whole or in part. And so if someone's had a heart attack and goes to a whole food plant-based diet, that is probably better than the medicines that one is prescribed or stents and the like. Not saying that, and I'm not some homeopathic, out there alternative physician. I am a real live Western trained physician, believe in Western medicine, 101%. But nutrition, food as medicine is critical. And there's plenty of evidence that, like I said, that not only is a healthy diet reduces the risk of primary heart disease, it reduces the risk of recurrence and mitigates disease severity. Type 2, big time. There's well-published studies showing that folks with type 2 diabetes who switch to a whole food plant-based diet see some combination of reduction in insulin need, can come off insulin entirely, see a reduction in other pharmacology for type 2, and sometimes are entirely off of medications, entirely off. There's been well-done studies on that. Neil Bernard at PCRM has shown this, and others. Hypertension, of course. Hypertension is easy to, there are people with rarer causes of hypertension, but hypertension based on diet and obesity, on too much salt, is easy and hard to reverse. It's hard to change diet, but it works. You can get your blood pressure down in a few weeks, a couple of months, by changing one's diet. The vasculature, and since probably most of us in this talk are not class of 2019, and so the vasculature hardens with age, and that relates to the heart attack risk and hypertension and the rest. Whole food plant-based diets can actually mitigate that, can actually make the vasculature less bad. And by cutting back on salt, one can fairly dramatically eliminate or reduce high blood pressure. And so it's really about not using salt, being careful about prepared foods, looking at labels, not throwing salt into recipes, and using other spices. Rheumatoid arthritis, a less common disease. It's an immune disease, and it can be disabling, but probably less severe on average than having multiple heart attacks and so on, but still a bad disease. There's a well-done study showing that RA can be mitigated and sometimes reversed by switch to whole food plant-based diet. It's quite dramatic. Okay, so what about plant-based meats, quote unquote? So there's the tofurkeys and field roast and all of those quote unquote plant-based meats that have been around for a while. For those of us that pay more attention to the markets than to health and nutrition and medicine, the IPOs for Impossible and Beyond and those companies and some others, there's a huge increase in good tasting plant-based meat, but they're not meat, of course. They're entirely plant-based substitutes. The oldie-timey ones, the ones that I actually enjoy more, because I've been doing this for 30 years, are probably healthier. They have lower amounts of saturated fat. The Impossible Beyond and some of the newer companies, they use coconut and palm and more saturated fat than you usually see in plant-based diets, because for the average Western palate, they taste better. It's what we're used to. And so the study out of Stanford just was published just a few months ago, in August of this year, in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And so the case control study, each patient in the study was their own control. These are people that baseline eat quote unquote regular diets. They were given 8 weeks of plant-based meats. So not a total vegan, whole food plant-based diet, 8 weeks of plant-based meats and 8 weeks of regular meat. And so during the 8 weeks, and so it was flipped. Half got the plant-based to start, half got the regular meat to start, and then it was just flipped 50-50. It was found that over 8 weeks, the people that, when they were on plant-based diets, had less TMAO, lower LDLs, and their weight dropped. So, which is somewhat reassuring for people that aren't ready to go to the kind of diet that I eat and enjoy the taste of what tastes like sort of regular meat to us. These foods are probably better for us or less worse certainly than red meat. It's interesting from a science point of view. The next bullet, the group that was randomized first to plant-based meat kept much of the reduction in TMAO, which is a high correlate with heart disease, when switched to regular meat, and not the other way around. So that's the conjecture, is that having been on plant-based quote unquote meats for 8 weeks, improved their microbiome for some period of time. So they went back to regular meat. They had a better microbiome. That won't last forever, but it lasted for 8 weeks at least. And their gut flora created less bacteria. Their gut bacteria created less TMAO. It's really interesting. Just to be the doobie here from a science and risk conflict statement point of view, this study was funded by NIH in part, so that's pretty serious, unbiased folks, and also Beyond Meat. And so in medicine all the time, when we're looking at drug studies funded by pharma, we always wonder about if they had some implicit way to get to the scientists. The paper's conflict statement: to reduce any influences on the study, analysis was conducted by third-party individuals who had no involvement in study design or collection of data and were blinded to which diet the participants were on. So, but I do, to be fair, want to mention part of that the study was funded by one of the companies that's in the business of selling, and you can see why they would be interested in the results and happy to see it published with good results. Okay, I better move on here. Sorry, going backwards. So the role of the clinician, and Dave and I have talked about this. There's a couple of slides on this. First, there's a program that's been around for a long time, 30 years, called the CHIP program, Complete Health Improvement Program, which is about diet and individual change and other lifestyle medicine attributes. You just find that it's chiphealth.com. They teach self-improvement, self-awareness, owning your own results, being in charge of yourself, and then go through the various modules in lifestyle medicine, especially but not exclusively diet. It's done over, I think, 3 months, 2 seminars or 2 modules a week. Actually, 2 months, 2 months, 2 modules a week. And in the past, it's been done in person, and that's a better learning environment for some folks, and it can be done online. Obviously, now it's entirely online. Um, um, this is a slide that I usually use but CHIP is for any of us, and it's a real commitment, and it's a worthwhile commitment. I encourage anybody interested to take a look. The next slide is a slide I use with docs, because physicians are busy. Everybody's busy, but you know, if you say to a physician, you have to say to a primary care doc who's seeing 3 or 4 patients an hour, in pediatrics 6 patients an hour sometimes, you need to spend 10 minutes on nutrition every visit. They'll look at you like you're from Mars. So Cochrane Review is just a rigorous evaluation of studies in medicine. So it was found that when doctors would talk to patients about smoking for 2 minutes, that would have an impact on behavior. And talking for 10 minutes is no more valuable than 2 minutes. The point here, of course, being that physicians should do something, and they don't have to do it for a long time. Supporting inclined patients and our own role modeling. You know, if you're a doc and you show up and you're, you know, just finished eating the double, you know, bacon cheeseburger, and you're, you know, 80 pounds overweight, you're probably not going to convince anybody to change their own diet. So this is a lot, but just to go through the bullets in terms of behavior change, what works, what doesn't. You know, most of this is shown in the peer review literature, you know, both medicine and psychology. But unlike a more clinically based study, you do drug A versus drug B, these kinds of studies so depend on the environment. It's where the patient's at, where the doctor's at, or the other health professional. So for behavior change, social supports matter. If you say to somebody in a big family, especially if she or he is not the primary person managing diet in the family, you should change your diet. Well, if the other folks don't come along, it's not going to happen. Patients, speaking to doctors here in large part, patients need to feel control over their own course of therapy. It can't just be the doctor, you know, saying do this, do that. Self-monitoring, you know, monitor yourself, get in the scale every day, check your blood pressure, you know, those kinds of things. And seeing, you know, if you're walking, you're walking farther. If you're jogging, you can jog farther. It really works. SMART goals, we use this in business all the time: specific, measurable, actionable, reproducible, and time limited, time sensitive. But having goals for patients, for us, that meet SMART goal criteria. All change is incremental, whether it's about health, whether it's about, you know, politics, whether it's about the world. The change is incremental. You can't say to somebody, you know, go from eating again a cheeseburger every night to the kind of diet that I'm talking about. Doctors should identify barriers. Physicians, like others, when trying to influence change, should sometimes do things in the form of a question versus a declarative statement. Physicians and listening, right there, you know, when this has been studied, the average time from when a physician is taking history in an exam room until the physician interrupts the patient is 8 seconds, which is very frustrating for patients, and we sometimes miss things. There are times, I would say, and in pediatrics, you know, if I seeing a little 8-year-old kid who broke her arm, and I say, what happened? And she goes on about, well, I was at grandma's house and we were having a nice meal. We went out to the park and blah, blah, going on for 2 minutes. Well, you know, you can't have that when you're the doc, but you can listen to people. Prescribe as a prescription, whole food, plant-based nutrition and exercise. Use a plate that we eat on as an example. The car mechanic thing, just an example. When I talk to docs about change and about explaining what we want patients to do and why. My example with medical students and residents and older physicians too. So think about, for those of us that aren't so mechanically inclined like me, many of us here probably are, go to the car mechanic and something's not working, and you know, $2,000 bill, and we ask for an explanation and have no idea in the world what he's talking or she is talking about. No idea. And so I remind physicians that when we explain to patients, whether about wellness regimens or about disease treatment, we go through the pathophys, what you should do, what you should expect. For most patients, for most of us in medicine, it's like hearing from the car mechanic. So we need to think about how we explain things, and And if someone can, you know how it is, if you can explain, if you can repeat back to someone what you were asked to do, you probably get it. And if you can't, it's, you know, over there. 5 R's: relevance, risk, rewards, roadblocks, repeat, just some basic behavior mod stuff here. Most of us know these kind of things. It's easy to say and hard to do. So why don't I'm almost done. Why don't clinicians do more? As Dave and I were chatting about, you know, just ahead of the talk, physicians don't get training in nutrition. The average. So again, I was in med school in the late 70s. I graduated from MIT in 75, and today the average amount of nutrition education, and not even whole food plant-based, just nutrition education in general, in medical school 4 years is about 3 hours. When I was in med school, I don't know if it was even measured. It might have been less than 3 hours, but it sure wasn't more. So we've been consistent over a couple, I guess, three generations now of physicians that we don't teach nutrition. Change is hard for docs, for patients. Genetics is hard too. You know, it's not really Darwin's fault, but you know, people know this, but we evolved from scarcity, like almost all creatures. The challenge until the modern world was not having enough calories. It wasn't the diseases of richness. So we're programmed, you know, our genes are programmed to crave calories, salt, fat, all the rest. So it requires some understanding and discipline and rigor. Physicians need to work on how to talk about change, should write scripts about lifestyle medicine, and so on and so forth. The next to the last bullet, I'll just say a word about that. So there's not a support in the practice. It's when physicians ask other physicians, PAs, NPs, and others to change their practice, if it's done in a vacuum without there being supports around, education and tools, it just doesn't happen. You know, I worked for a number of years for a health plan that took care of the poor. It was based in Cambridge, actually, and served Massachusetts. And our members were all impoverished. And so the funding came from the feds and the state, and we provided financing, access to care, case management, primary care docs, the sorts of things you do in a commercial health plan, but for impoverished people. And we would try and influence the docs, my colleagues, to practice in a certain kind of way. And it would be hard to get change. And the things that worked the best would be when we would provide resources that were helpful. So when my health plan started to put some social workers in practices to help people with, you know, getting to the doctor's office, getting their kid off the school bus, just very, you know, keeping appointments, very basic one-on-one stuff. The docs loved us, and it helped. It had a real change. Whereas when we would go in there talking about, you know, the percent of your patients that are not complying with asthma treatment or something like that, you get a look like, yeah, you walked in our shoes for a lot of years. What are we going to do about it? So it's got to be about supports in the practice and training, and attitude. This is a long list of organizations in this space. Nutrition Facts is Gregor's organizations. Blue Zones I talked about. I can send the slide. Well, this will all be on the website in a couple of weeks, and there's a lot here. Lighter is a commercial organization that helps people with their diets. I mentioned Harvard Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. PCRM is the oldest organization in this space. I mentioned Lifestyle Medicine. Plantrition Project gives talks, conferences on plant-based nutrition. Balanced helps schools, universities, hospitals, and others to offer better diets in their own space. Because, you know, lots of hospital cafeterias serve crappy food. WholesomeWave.org provides education access to these sorts of principles for impoverished populations and different ethnic groups and folks who in America who English is not their first language. So it's not just some doc coming in there talking about, sounding like he's talking about Boulder, you know, Colorado, and Whole Foods and stuff. So they're very, very helpful. And then, so my organization is pan-usa.org, and we're global, so the international organization. A quick word about PAN. So We engage health professionals, the public, and policymakers about the role of whole food plant-based nutrition in promoting good health and preventing and treating disease. We strive to make nutrition a key part of medical school education. We empower health professionals by providing evidence-based educational material, effective nutrition programs, and resources. We are building a global network of health professionals, scientists, and students, and also working from a medical perspective on policy change. I'm also spearheading, we're just starting spearheading a program on whole food plant-based nutrition and children, which is, no one's done that. And so we're going to be doing that shortly as well. One more, Gregor, we should all be eating fruits and vegetables as if our lives depend on it, because they do. He has a different touch than I do. So, end of the talk. Got to have a deliberate right. That concludes my 2 hours, 1 hour, just short of an hour, 50 minutes, 2-hour presentation. Any questions? Did you intend the presentation to be incomprehensible? Or do you have some sort of rare PowerPoint disability? Any questions about the content? There was content. So there you go. That's Dilbert. And here's, as we close or go to phase 2, which is Q&A, here's again my organization's resources. And feel free, anybody who wants to reach out to me, give me a call, or a.kornberg at Pan-USA. And again, there's our website info, which is easy to find. So that ends the canned talk part of the presentation, and I'm happy to take anybody's questions. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Allan. And there's been several many questions. Some of them are more general than others. I think I'll start with some of those. There was one question from, let's see here. Here we go. Bob Niedorf asked about, is it possible that on a plant-based diet you have insufficient protein? And if so, what do you do about it?
So it's impossible. That's the, for folks in this space, when we, so I don't mean to be trite. It's the first question that comes up. It's a really important question, and it's not a problem. So that people that do what I do for a living, now, when we talk about giving talks, we always say, that's always the first question. People always want to know about that. And so if you get 2,000 calories a day, average, well, most of us are probably eating way more than 2,000 calories a day. If you get enough calories, you'll get enough protein. There's 8 to 10, there's 20 amino acids, 8 to 10 are essential, which means our bodies don't make them. They make that from other protein. And while it is true on the one hand that that meat has all 20 amino acids and all the essential amino acids, and many plant sources of protein, and all plants have protein, and so, even things like kale and lettuce, there's not a lot of calories there, but it's a high percentage of what you're eating is protein, and lentils, nuts, all the rest loaded with protein. So, but the essential amino acid question that comes up sometimes, so going a little past your question, while many plant-based, it makes sense that meat would have all 20 amino acids, because you're eating, a mammal or a bird. While many plant sources don't have only have some, but not all the essential amino acids, any variety of plant-based diet doesn't have to all be at one serving. You get all the essential amino acids. So it really is. There's much more here, but hand over heart, it is impossible, absent medical disease like malabsorption or renal disease and so on. It is impossible to not get enough protein if you are getting enough calories. It just is impossible. And of course, I could be tried and talk about, gorillas and elephants and, big, strong animals that are entirely plant-based. They obviously get enough protein, and gorillas aren't that far from us DNA-wise. But the short answer to the question, I just gave a speech, sorry, is if you eat enough calories, you get enough protein. The only folks that are protein deficient in the world either have an unusual medical disease or are malnourished, don't get enough calories, like the horrible pictures of kids in poor countries with swollen bellies. That's because they're not getting enough calories.
Okay. So there was a related question from Tom Neal, who has a situation similar to mine. So let me describe me.
Yeah.
I was a vegan for 2 years, and I became anemic. I couldn't give blood anymore. And I was eating spinach and broccoli and cooking my tomato sauce in cast iron pans, and I was taking B12 supplements and iron supplements. You know, I was doing everything you're supposed to do as far as we could tell, and I was still anemic. And so eventually I had to go back to meat, and eventually I became not anemic anymore. And so Tom Neal has something similar. He says, I tend toward low red blood cells, and my doctor says to eat more red meat. What are the alternatives?
Now, those are good questions. There is it does take a little more work to get enough iron from plant-based sources, and so if one is a frequent blood donor, that can happen. I mean, it's being, and I've given blood for a long time. Being a blood donor is a noble thing to do. It also is, you know, when you give blood, you're having about, depending on one's size and weight, you know, about 10% of your 8 to 10% of your body's blood is removed, you know, in one sitting. So, which is fine, but it certainly requires having more iron to catch up again. It's there's a bunch of sources of iron, and you know, as you said, the green, you know, leafy vegetables are good sources. The legumes are good sources as well. Peas, beans, lentils, and so on are particularly good sources. There's some. I would also add that there's a fair amount of evidence that iron or too much iron is carcinogenic, or so that tumor cells do well in a high iron environment, and so being anemic is not a good thing. Being low normal iron and not anemic is probably better than being high normal iron. So it's not as if striving for the highest iron level is necessarily a good thing, but having enough is clearly a good thing. And that's a fair question. And iron is, you know, one of those nutrients you have to pay a little attention to. You also can, you know, people choose to be, you know, plant-based for three main reasons. There's the ethical reason, there's the environment, and there's health. If one's, you know, if one's motivation is ethical, there's probably more aspiration or more movement towards 100% plant-based. If one is 90 and 95% plant-based, you get all the health benefits. And the doc saying eat red meat is, you know, that's what most docs say, and it really isn't necessary. So, but if you're giving blood a lot, you're gonna sort of challenge that system. But that's a very good and fair question. Hopefully I sort of kind of answered it.
All right, so here's somewhat related. So are these suggestions universal in the sense that they're good for everybody? Because Andrew Allan asked the question, do you foresee an era in the near future where a personal genomics approach can help physicians or nutrition specialists tailor a diet content to an individual's particular biochemistry?
Maybe. I mean, in 100 years, probably. In 10 or 20 years, you know, probably not. I mean, probably the biggest, going, you know, past my pay grade and past this talk, probably the biggest advances in medicine on individual therapeutics and precision medicine, if you will, is in the treatment of cancers, where there's been some major breakthroughs and much more to come there. Everything I've described is population health, is general principles. It's quite true, and should work for the preponderance of people who are otherwise healthy. If one has a significant disease, one has to pay attention to that. I really don't have a perfect answer for that question. There might be, you know, and as I said, if one has a whole food plant-based dominant diet, there's gobs of evidence that that's good for us. Beyond that, it's conjecture, and I don't know. Sorry.
All right, so here's a question about organics. So when the store sells something that's quote organic, is that worthwhile? No different? What do you think?
So I haven't spoke to that. I mean, my own behavior. So sometimes it's sometimes it's good to speak to one's own choices, and sometimes, well, that's an N of 1, it's anecdotal, it's not science. There's the evidence for, organics mean that that I think everybody knows, but it has nothing to do with animal welfare. It has nothing to do with, or almost nothing to do with, the nutrients in the foods. It's about pesticides and other chemical compounds that are put on the foods when they're grown. So that's what organic is about. It seems commonsensical and makes sense to me that it's better to eat foods with fewer pesticides than foods with more pesticides. Because pesticides, there's some crossover between our physiology and insects. That makes good common sense to me. The medical literature on the harm of on the medical literature on the benefit of eating organics is pretty thin. So there's much more evidence that whole food plant-based nutrition is way good for us than there's evidence that organics are way good for us. I choose to buy organics when I can, but I'm not religious about it. And the evidence is thin, which is interesting.
So it might be a marginal improvement, but not.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair. And there also may be, I think that's true on a population basis. The challenge always, so there's no question. What I'm talking about around cancers in general, heart disease in general, diabetes, yeah. It's hard to find small effects on a population basis. So there may be some cancers that, have a 20-40% increase incidence because of, eating the pesticides, but it's hard to tease that out. And it's so that what you said, the evidence is thin right now.
Okay. All right. There were a number of comments about salt. The question is it table salt that you would add? That's not the problem, but mostly processed food salt. Is potassium chloride salt better than sodium chloride salt? Other forms like sea salt, do they make any difference? What do you think?
It's really good questions. And I'd say the questions I'm getting tonight are better than I get from doctors and medical students. I'm not shocked about that. So it's NaCl. It's the very simple compound sodium chloride, right? One ion of each. That's all that matters. So potassium. So let me wind back a step. The comments I'm making are about people that are generally healthy, for age. If someone has significant renal disease and it takes a lot of potassium chloride, you're going to kill yourself. So it's this is about people that are otherwise healthy, that have, for age, good kidney, good liver function, and so on, which are most of us. So sodium chloride is bad for us. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter if you have a salt shaker with plain sodium chloride. It doesn't matter if it's in processed food or it's right off the salt shaker. It doesn't matter if it's sea salt or kosher salt, or if it's sodium chloride, it's too much is bad. Potassium chloride is good. Spices are good. Pepper's good. Sodium chloride is bad. And so the average, again, in a wealthy country like ours, where we don't suffer from not getting enough sodium. So the recommendation is, and again, this is for if you're 25 years old and your blood pressure is low and you're not obese and all those sorts of things, and don't worry so much about sodium right now, but think about when you get older. It has less of a long-term effect than a short-term effect. The impact of lipids, of cholesterol, that is a lifelong impact, and you just build it up over the years. Sodium chloride and hypertension is more short-term effect, but it is good to have. We've always taught that, we doctors, 120/80 is a good blood pressure. Again, for somebody who's otherwise healthy, not in shock, 110/70 is better. 100/60 is better still. 135/85, 140/90, which used to be like high normal, has a significant high, like 40% or so, sometimes higher, increased risk of mortality based on cardiovascular disease. So having a low normal blood pressure is better than a normal blood pressure, and And if you can have, 2 to 3 grams of sodium a day and not 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, and you're otherwise healthy on a population basis, that's way better for us.
There were a number of questions related to inflammatory foods. We didn't see gluten and dairy on your list. Are those things inflammatory? Let's see. There also is a question about most people eat inflammatory and anti-inflammatory foods in combination. Does the literature suggest that there are offsetting effects based on that biochemistry? Similar question, are some individuals more or less vulnerable to inflammatory effects of foods based on genetic factors?
Yeah, these are good questions. I don't have the answer to all of them. So dairy is inflammatory. It's not as inflammatory as red meat, but it's inflammatory. Gluten is
What does inflammatory mean? Let's start with that.
Well, that's a really good and critical question. So there's a number of active biologic agents that swim around in our bloodstream, and that either increase inflammation internally or decrease inflammation internally. So inflammation is sometimes good, right? You have an infection, you want to have inflammation because that kills the bad bugs. You have an abscess, that's all about inflammation. The problem is when all of those inflammatory modulators of different sorts are provoked to sort of go after host, if you will. And so that's the problem. It's sort of good inflammation versus bad inflammation. And so the anti-inflammatory foods, the anti-inflammatory chemicals, keep the amount of intrinsic inflammation lower without any impact on the healthy immune response. So I should also mention that if you eat more, strawberries or blueberries, it's not as if you're going to have you're not going to have enough, immune response to the next, disease you get. So that's the sort of 101 on inflammation. Gluten is a kind of grain, right? So oats, barley, wheat, and so gluten has got a lot of attention in the last, I guess, generation, really. Most restaurants, back when we used to go to restaurants, would have gluten, gluten-free menus now. There's a disease in medicine called celiac disease, and so that's a real disease. It's a pretty serious disease, and if you eat gluten grains, you're going to have a big time inflammatory effect in your gut. You're going to have malabsorption. You're going to get really sick. There's been a fair amount of science and a fair amount of pseudoscience in the last generation about people that don't have celiac disease having a bad effect from gluten. And so some of that's real, and some of that is not so real. But that's a different space from inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, and whole food. So if you don't have celiac disease, gluten enteropathy, and if you aren't genuinely biologically sensitive to gluten, eating the various gluten grains are good for you. They're good, healthy whole grains. So it is a little bit harder to be on this kind of diet if you are gluten sensitive, because you have to avoid some healthy grains.
Okay.
I think I got most of that.
Yeah, that's fine. This is from Debbie Godfrey. Does whole food plant-based nutrition have any effect on Alzheimer's disease?
Yes, there's more and more evidence about that. And let me wind back. I missed one part of the question before, which is because I didn't know the answer to it, but I will look this up so that I have a guess. But it was about if you're on the one hand, it's about eating some inflammatory and some anti-inflammatory food. So it's true. If you eat more anti-inflammatory foods and fewer inflammatory foods over time, that's better for us. Does it matter if it's at the same sitting or not? Does one knock out the other one at the same sitting? I've not seen that. I don't know I don't think so, but I don't know the answer to that. I will look that up and get back to you about that. There is a lot on Alzheimer's, a lot of theories about Alzheimer's. There is some of that is genetic, right? It's genetic is real, but we can influence our genetics and our risk. And so the impact of lifestyle medicine or lifestyle change in general is highly important to reduce the chances of getting Alzheimer's, to reduce chances of ever getting it, to get it later, or to get it less bad. So it's all the sorts of things. It's about sense community. It's about exercise. It's about being cognitively stimulated. Lower body exercise, leg exercise is especially healthy. Getting the heart rate up some. So for those of us that, and as I've learned more about this, I've started to, for a while I stopped jogging and I just would walk. I do other things too, but now I jog again, and I'm jogging longer distances because there's some evidence that is protective to some extent around dementias, Alzheimer's, and it goes back to the inflammatory discussion that I've been talking about and probably perseverating on, but for good cause. Anti-inflammatory diet is protective on a population basis towards dementias, towards Alzheimer's. It's always hard, these studies, because they're not randomized controlled trials, right? So what the physicians and epidemiologists do, or they look at populations and they do these complicated multiple regressions to try to take out all of the confounders and try to just look at diet or just look at exercise and control for everything else. It's never as clean as a randomized controlled trial, but there's gobs of studies that, or at least a good number, that show that a healthy diet and healthy weight is, on a population basis, significantly protected. Yes.
Okay. Here's a question. Are lectins in vegetables, such as tomatoes, good or bad? What is a lectin?
I am not. I know the term, and I'm not really able to give a good answer. So
okay.
But we'll get back to you on that too. And I don't know the answer to. So I'll get back to you on that.
Okay. There are some questions that are related to specific diets from specific authors. So, for example, any opinion on the Ayurvedic diet, Ayurvedic? Any herb that is a superfood, such as amla, and would you say that Michael Greger outline of the whole food plant-based diet includes the Ayurvedic diet?
Michael talks about some herbs for sure, and turmeric is always the first herb that gets positive attention. There are some others. That's Ayurvedic medicine is Indian, South Asian medicine, and so that's an Indian diet, and it's so probably the single healthiest. So the herbs in general are good and healthy for us. And Greger talks about it a lot. Turmeric is especially well known to be healthy, and beyond that, I am not as expert as I should be, and so I really can't go beyond that.
Okay. Are you familiar with something called "How to Feed a Brain" by Calvin Ballister?
I am not. No.
Okay. This says it's asking about research regarding low carbs and high healthy fats being better for brain healing. No.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, and I have sort of healthy skepticism in that space, generally speaking. But I'm not familiar.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else we have here. All right. So I guess so here's a question. There are some people have good results with protein-heavy, low-carb diets, such as Atkins. What do you think of those things?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. I mean, there's really there's not good evidence that that's healthy over a long period of time, and so what I think and what I read and what I understand is a diet that's predominantly whole food plant-based and has, lots of complex carbs and enough protein and healthy fats, but not too much fat is the way to go. And I am not a big fan of Atkins, and I've not seen convincing evidence that it's if somebody feels better, they feel better. I've not seen convincing evidence that it's healthier on a population basis. So I would not give that thumbs up.
Okay. So this one, I don't quite understand the question, but anyways, has any reputable research organization looked at a possible role of nutrition in mitigating the terrible pro-inflammatory signaling at the cellular level driven by senescent cells?
Senescent cells or older?
Senescent.
Yeah. SENESCENT.
Yes. So probably the peer review literature that speaks to that, I think I'm being responsive, goes back to to some extent, the journal comments about antioxidants, about anti-inflammatory foods, and also about telomeres in particular, so that the cells can die for other reasons, but cells die because the DNA gives up eventually, and the DNA gives up because it's been replicated so many times, and the faster that our chromosomes get shorter, the quicker the cell dies. And when that happens on a organism population basis, absent mitigating disease or trauma, we die faster versus slower. And so anti-inflammatories, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant-rich diets are just lots and lots of evidence on a cellular basis and on a human clinical study basis and animal studies too, that's protective. So I think if I'm getting so by senescent cells, I'm sort of going to senescent DNA, senescent chromosomes, and I think the short answer to that question is yes, there is evidence.
Okay. All right, I'm going to make this the last question unless somebody types a new one. Has the whole food approach been shown in the literature to help slow the buildup of advanced glycation end products, AGEs, AGES, in various tissue groups like arterial tissues in individuals of advanced age, such as over 75?
So sorry, in terms of was it about the
glycation end products, whatever that is.
It has
advanced glycation end products, AGE.
So I think I'm answering what the questioner is asking. There's real evidence, and there's clinical evidence that so if you look at people that have had heart attacks, and their arteries look ugly, they're loaded with plaque, right, the coronaries and so on.
Sure.
If one goes to a whole food plant-based diet, one reduces the risk of recurrent MIs, and in some subset of patients, but a significant subset of patients, the arteries actually begin to look better. So it's not just it's not just having the aging process in arteries not move as quickly. You can actually reverse some of the damage in the artery. If you're 75 years old and you had a couple of heart attacks, your arteries are never going to look like, when you're 18. The flip side being when you're people that are 18 or 21, sadly, that die from trauma, you'll see plaques in the arteries already, which is sort of a shocking thing for us. So it happens early. But there is evidence. There is clinical evidence. I don't know if there's autopsy evidence. There's clinical. I'll have to look that up. But there's clinical evidence that if you look at the population of people that have heart attacks, those people that commit to a healthy diet, their arteries look less worse over time, and they have fewer heart attacks. So I think that's what the question is getting to.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Kornberg.